So thanks everyone for showing up. I know it's hard right now to actually attend these kinds of presentations, so I appreciate it. I'm Dean Easy. This is joint work with my colleagues Hal Martin and Kristen Tauber. Also at the Cleveland Fed, as Adria mentioned. And I have to say before I get going that these views are my own, and I'm not speaking for the Federal Reserve Bank of Cleveland or the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System. So I guess I'll just get going. Excited to speak with you all, and hope I get a chance to actually ask some of you questions. But anyway, so we're going to ask this question: what determines the success of housing mobility programs? So there's a lot of interest right now in public housing in the United States in trying to come up with policies that can actually combat residential segregation and provide opportunity. So the Housing Choice Voucher Program, as most people on the line probably know, is the largest federal public housing program in the United States. A broad overview is that about 30% of tenants' rent has to come from their own income, and the voucher that they have will pay the remainder of their rent and utilities through this program. And there's generally been recognized to be a problem that there seems to be a really high concentration of voucher tenants in low opportunity neighborhoods. And there's a couple of potential solutions to that have come up. So one is that we set maximum subsidies using a local rent. So in a small area, say a zip code, rather than an entire metro area, because one issue could be, excuse me, by setting subsidy caps at a broad scale at a metro level, you might be pricing people out of certain neighborhoods. And then in terms of housing mobility programs, there's broadly, I would say, two general approaches. One is what was tried with Moving to Opportunity was to restrict voucher use to some definition of high opportunity areas. And then when you think about the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, or more recently, the Creating Moves to Opportunity Program, and then some of the programs that I'm sure that people on the line are involved with, in addition to, say, having some kind of local rent, there's also the idea of trying to actually aid tenants or aid landlords in high opportunity areas. And as I said, there's a lot of attention to this. So people on the line probably just put in applications for this 6-year Housing Choice Voucher mobility demonstration that HUD is going to be running. So that's where we are. But I think it's worth discussing the origins of housing mobility programs for a minute here. So the figure on the left is, are the details. But on the right, for the Gautreaux Housing Mobility Program, which as far as I know is the first one, it came out of a lawsuit that was filed in Chicago by residents of public housing. And it alleged that the public housing authority there was essentially intentionally segregating the city by race by the way where it was placing units. And again, you can look at the map, you can look at the details, and I actually believe that a map like this is what sealed the deal in terms of the actual court case, according to Alex Polikoff. But you look between 1950 and 1966, whether you want to talk about a tract that, how essentially what share of the residents were Black, you see that the vast majority of tracts were in tracts that were overwhelmingly African American. Moving forward to a little bit later in Baltimore, we can see that the Thompson case that I believe was started in 1995 was a very similar argument. So again, there was no new legal precedent that was broken or kind of made. It was the same kind of argument that was made in Gautreaux, and I believe the same kind of argument that can be made in most major metropolitan areas in the United States, which is that the housing authority was very clearly kind of segregating the city by race in where it was placing units. Now, we're going to talk a little bit about 4 prominent housing mobility programs, and I'm going to talk about them in terms of their target population and their target destinations a little bit. So 4 of the most prominent housing mobility programs, of course, were Gautreaux, which started in 1976. And that was targeted towards low-income Black residents in Chicago public housing projects. A little bit later, inspired by the promising results of Gautreaux, was Moving to Opportunity. So Moving to Opportunity was targeted towards low-income residents in projects in some of the lowest opportunity neighborhoods in the US. It was in 5 cities, and it was about 2/3 African American. The BHMP Yeah, I think it started a little bit before 2002, but officially, I think that's when all the legal stuff was kind of finalized. You have low-income residents in Baltimore public housing, is my understanding of who is being targeted. And then recently in Seattle and King County, Washington, there was the Creating Moves to Opportunity program that was focused on low-income residents. Now, in terms of where people are being encouraged to move, in Gautreaux, you had essentially the entire Chicago metropolitan area. And there were two groups. And essentially how you got allocated to one group or the other, at least in the beginning, was mainly based on your spot in the wait list and what became available. But there were two groups. One went to city tracts that, because of some kind of investment, were forecast to undergo some kind of revitalization. Those were predominantly African-American, and at the time ended up being a lot higher poverty than the suburban tracts that people were encouraged to move to through Gautreaux that were supposed to be integrated neighborhoods. So the restriction was less than 30% Black residents. Now, moving opportunity was actually administered in terms of each PHA's jurisdiction. And the restriction was that households had to move to tracts with less than or equal to 10% poverty. So this is how opportunity areas were defined. In Baltimore, originally we had something that was kind of a combination of Gautreaux and MTO, additionally with less than 5% of residents in the tract being assisted. And then in 2015 forward, with the BRHP taking charge, they've been using, I believe it's 21 actual variables, but there's a composite index of several variables, and you take tracts in the top third, and that's where you encourage people to move. And then in terms of CMTO, it's essentially looking at some of the top tracts as rated by the Opportunity Atlas, whether in Seattle or in King County. Now, to look at what has happened with these programs, I think it's really important to look at a figure like this. So I'm not sure how used people are to looking at a figure like this. So I just wanted to explain it a little bit here. So on the x-axis on the bottom here, we have the poverty rate. This is a raw measure of a neighborhood characteristic. And then on the y-axis on the left here, we have a tract ranking. So the red line here shows you in 1990, the population of white Americans, and it gives you a sense of what kind of neighborhoods they lived in. So a 10% poor neighborhood was about the 40th percentile for the US non-Hispanic white population in 1990. So this gives you some sense, when you look at these black lines here, it gives you some sense and some way of mapping the raw characteristics to kind of what kind of neighborhoods do people typically experience. So I think this is really important in this context, because if you think about something like a 10% reduction in the poverty rate, if you start at a neighborhood that's 10% poor, you would expect really big changes in that neighborhood. So what I mean by that is if you go from 10% poor, that means you're in a neighborhood that 60% of people live in lower poverty neighborhoods, to 0% poor. Those are the kind of economically most advantaged neighborhoods in the entire country. Whereas if you were going to start in a neighborhood that had an 80% poverty rate, and you also decrease the poverty rate in the neighborhood by 10%, you might not expect as big of differences in the actual kind of neighborhood characteristics more broadly, because you're moving from very exceptional neighborhoods still to very exceptional neighborhoods. And that's going to be really important, I think, in terms of how we think about the results of housing mobility programs. So to start, we can look at Gautreaux. And what we see is, in terms of the baseline mean, people before they moved through Gautreaux were living some of the highest poverty neighborhoods in the entire US. And in terms of the initial lease up, where people moved right after their first move, they were going in the suburbs to very low poverty neighborhoods that were about the 70th percentile for whites in the United States. So these initial lease up numbers are really positive and really great. Now, if you follow up 6 to 22 years later, you see that the suburban mean has fallen back to higher poverty neighborhoods. Not so much in terms of the raw neighborhood poverty rate, but in terms of the tract ranking, it's fallen considerably. Now, this to me tells us there's two things here. First, this is 6 to 22 years later. So this is, a lot of time has passed. So I would still consider this to be a success, but looking at the difference between the initial lease ups and where people are many years later, I think highlights the importance of things like counseling things that we're going to gloss over in our simulations, but that you all, in terms of actually administering these programs, are thinking about a lot, and that in terms of actual outcomes, we think matter a lot. Now, if we look at moving to opportunity, in terms of the initial lease up, from a baseline mean of almost 50% poor, you have a complier. So this is after moving, after that initial lease up, getting almost to the 30th percentile of the US white population, a little bit over 10% poverty rate. So again, something that I think is very important to note in terms of MTO is that that baseline mean, when I've studied MTO, I've referred to it as the other 1%, because it's people living in really the most economically disadvantaged neighborhoods in the US. And so I think that's really important to keep in mind when we're looking at MTO. And then when we look 4 to 7 years later, we see that the complier mean, essentially the group that moved with the program, has fallen back considerably. Now the poverty rate is about, on average, 20%. And these are for the people that did move, not just that were offered, but then didn't move. And that's about the 10th percentile. So, you know, this figure, I think, I'll say in terms of my own thinking about MTO, I think is really important, because if you think about raw changes in poverty rates, 50 to 20 or something along those lines sounds very big, and in many ways it is. But if you think about kind of the changes in terms of where other people live and how exceptional these neighborhoods are, it might not be that big of a move. And then the question becomes, how far up this red line do moves have to be to start seeing effects? And I'll just make the point that when I think about MTO, I think that the moves up that red line, there's one way of thinking about it in terms of that y-axis, the vertical axis, is that the moves that we saw in MTO were actually just not large enough in a lot of ways to generate very large effects, to generate neighborhood effects. An important point about that is that I'm showing you neighborhood poverty here, but in MTO, you had, in many of the sites, you had African Americans moving around predominantly Black neighborhoods. And in MTO cities around 2000, low poverty Black neighborhoods looked like high poverty white neighborhoods on other dimensions that we think matter and drive outcomes. So things like unemployment rates, educational attainment. So to take this into consideration, and also to try to think about what can we learn about neighborhood effects when there's really relatively small changes here, I'll just make a comment that in a recent paper of mine, we use statistical methods to identify people in MTO that we think are stayers and movers. So stayers are people that, whether they get the MTO voucher or not, we don't think their neighborhood quality is going to improve much based on our statistical model. Movers are people who, if they get the MTO voucher, we think they're actually going to move to higher quality neighborhoods as a result. So this figure is showing you that, in fact, our statistical model is able to predict how people moved in these groups pretty well. So when you look at the stayers, their neighborhood quality when they got an MTO voucher went from under the first percentile to about a little bit under the second percentile. So again, these are percentiles of the national distribution from 0 to 100. So these are still within very low quality neighborhoods. When we're talking about movers though, they move from about the first percentile on average to just under, well, just over the 6th percentile. And so now the question is, if these are comparable people using our statistical model, do we actually see large changes for the movers? And the answer is yes. Again, these aren't huge changes in neighborhood characteristics, but they are, trying to find the largest ones that we can see in MTO. And what we see is that in terms of adult labor market outcomes, things actually did improve. So household income went up, and this compares with the people who stayed, the stayers, who didn't have an effect. Now, when thinking about kind of the size of the changes in neighborhood characteristics in MTO, as I just did, I think it's really important then to contrast that, or to think about that when we look at what's happened in Baltimore. So the Baltimore Housing Mobility Program, when you look at initial lease-ups from 2002 to 2012, you see this massive increase. Again, this is much more like Gautreaux, where you see people going up to almost the 80th percentile of neighborhood rankings. And what you see is that 1 to 10 years later, which is pretty comparable to 4 to 7 years later, that mover mean, the complier mean, has fallen back, but not that much. And this to me signals that something is going on in Baltimore really good. So that's telling me that in terms of counseling, in terms of making sure people are getting to neighborhoods where they're comfortable, where they're stable, all these kinds of things, Baltimore seems to be doing it right. And then when you look at the most recent data from Baltimore in terms of 2019, you just see, again, like I said, I think there are just these massive changes in neighborhoods that we don't see with, as far as I understand, with any other program. And so when I look at that figure, I just want to come to Baltimore, ask you all what you're doing and learn about it, because it's very clear to me that you all are doing a lot of things right, and you're really just leading the charge. Okay, so I've kind of bragged on you all in Baltimore, but this is just looking at the data. And then we can look at CMTO, the recent program, and we can see that, again, so now there's going to be some changes. So these are initial lease up in 2019 in Seattle, and you see changes of about 20 percentile points in terms of tract rankings, in terms of poverty. Okay, so this gives some context in which we can start thinking about the design of housing mobility programs. And as you saw there, there's different ways, there's a couple different questions that will face, I think, all of you on the phone or just all of us in general when thinking about housing mobility programs. So the first one is, how do we want to measure neighborhood effects? If we're going to create an opportunity map, how do we go about this? And there's a couple different ways. So I've shown poverty, which is kind of a canonical neighborhood variable that we think measures neighborhood externalities, at least going back to William Julius Wilson's work. In the paper that I mentioned, where we study MTO, we put 6 characteristics together into a single index because we think that in addition to poverty, educational attainment, labor market outcomes, these kinds of things matter. But that index doesn't have anything about school quality, environmental quality. And so that's all included in the Childhood Opportunity Index, which in many ways is similar to neighborhood quality, just has a lot more variables. It's harder to actually compile and put together. And then now we have this amazing new data set, which is called the Opportunity Atlas, published by Opportunity Insights, which is really incredible. It tracks the 1978 to 1983 birth cohorts, and using income tax data and census data is able to estimate outcomes for a bunch of different outcomes for a bunch of different demographic characteristics. But the important one that we're going to use to think about here is going to be tract level estimates of children's income conditional on what their parents' household income was when they were growing up in the neighborhood. And so this is really a wonderful new data set that's allowing us to think in new ways about neighborhoods. So we have these different measures. And then the question that gets posed to you all is, well, how do you want to draw your opportunity map? How do you want to do it? Which measure do you want to use? So this map shows Baltimore, and it shows tracts that are in the top third of opportunity locally, in white by no measure, by blue by the Childhood Opportunity Index alone, red quality alone, green the Opportunity Atlas alone, and in black here by 2 or more. And so the first thing that I would want to point out in this figure is just, if you look in the dark shaded areas, most of the time these measures agree, but they don't always agree. And so the question is, what do you all do when they don't agree? And we can look at this also statistically. So if you look at this statistically, I want to make a couple comments here. So on the x-axis here on the bottom is 2018 neighborhood quality. And on the y-axis here, the green dots are going to show you the Opportunity Atlas ranking of the same neighborhoods. These are 1,000 randomly drawn census tracts from the United States. And the blue is going to show you the Childhood Opportunity Index. So the important thing that I want to show you here is, first of all, if you look at the blue dots and you look on the left there, a tract that's ranked very low in terms of neighborhood quality is also going to be ranked very low in terms of the Childhood Opportunity Index. So there is some disagreement, but it's not large disagreement. The same thing is true if you look on the right of the figure, and very highly ranked neighborhood quality tracts, those are not going to be ranked low by the Childhood Opportunity Index. There's not many blue dots in the bottom corner, bottom right corner. In contrast, when you look at the Opportunity Atlas, there's a lot of additional variation and a lot of disagreement. So, for example, if you look at group A here on the top left, those are neighborhoods that both COI or, in this case, neighborhood opportunity is going to rank very low, but the Opportunity Atlas is going to say that it's a very good neighborhood for kids to grow up in. In contrast, if you look in the bottom right in group B, those are neighborhoods that neighborhood quality is going to say is a very high opportunity area, but the Opportunity Atlas is going to say it's one that's very low opportunity for kids. So we have another paper where we essentially look at this and we try to understand how to interpret these disagreements. So it's very clear in a lot of ways that there's information about neighborhood effects in the Opportunity Atlas. So you can do a bunch of different things to see that the way that there are disagreements between the Opportunity Atlas and contemporary measures, it looks like it's capturing things that matter. So we think there's new information in the Opportunity Atlas, but it's also the case that there are these issues around changes over time and sample sizes that make it a little bit difficult to discern when the disagreements with the Opportunity Atlas and contemporary measures are driven more by information and when by noise. So this is Baltimore, and this is showing you on the x-axis neighborhood quality, the local rank, and the Opportunity Atlas rankings, the same tracks in Baltimore. And now in red here, those are tracks that between 1990, in some sense what the Opportunity Atlas is measuring, and 2018 experienced large changes in quality, so large changes in the socioeconomic characteristics of residents. And in blue, those are tracks that in the 1990 census had less than 30 low-income children. So these are kind of being flagged as places where we're not as sure about these tracks and the disagreements and how to interpret them. And so when we take those out and we look at Baltimore, it looks like when you are just focused on tracks that haven't changed a lot over time and that we think there's kind of reliably enough children to trust the Opportunity Atlas estimates, we see that these start to agree a lot more like quality or the Childhood Opportunity Index do. So this is just a caveat to just say that, when you're looking at the Opportunity Atlas and you're looking at the data, we think it's important. Well, again, we think there's information being added, no question. We do think it's important that practitioners look at how much those places have changed over time, how kind of confident we are in those estimates before really interpreting disagreements very strongly with contemporary measures. Okay, so given that this is kind of a broad issue in terms of opportunity mapping, now I'm going to go into thinking about housing mobility programs, and we're going to do some simulations to try to isolate the effects of different factors. So the baseline simulation we're going to run is we're going to target a population that's low-income African Americans in the lowest ranked tracts in their metro area. The target destination where we're going to be encouraging people to move is going to be the entire metro area. So this is going to be the top third of the metro's tract in the first baseline case according to neighborhood quality. And now the way we're going to deal with housing supply is we're going to have families move uniformly to targeted neighborhoods that have sufficient rental units. Now, this is a really, non-obvious issue. And how do we want to think about units that are both available and affordable in each tract and think about housing supply? So the way we're going to do it here as a first pass is we're going to say, okay, we think the rental supply as a first approximation in a tract is going to be 7.5% of that tract's 2-bedroom and larger rental units. So if the rental supply, if there's more than 30 units in that case, then we're just going to assume that 30 families move into that tract. If the rental supply is some number less than 30, whatever that supply is, that's how many families we're going to allow to move into that tract. And so this 30 in terms of rental supply in a place like Baltimore, you see, especially in higher quality tracts, but to be honest, really across the board, you see that this supply issue is quite binding. There's a lot of tracts that are below the 30 cutoff, and the same thing in Cleveland. And again, this is even more so in the higher opportunity neighborhoods. So we're going to make a couple of simplifying assumptions when we do these simulations. First, we're going to have families moving from the lowest opportunity neighborhoods. That's going to be making some assumptions about how you recruit people who's selecting into the housing mobility program. We're going to say that families move uniformly to targeted neighborhoods. So both that and the idea that families are going to stay in their new neighborhoods, that's going to be an assumption about housing supply, preferences of participants, counseling, landlord outreach, all these things that you all are thinking and working hard on that in our simulations we're going to not get into. And nobody in the receiving neighborhoods is going to move out in response. Again, that's going to be an assumption about residential preferences. So now when we think about the success of housing mobility programs, we have to ask this question, well, how do we define success? And that comes back to, well, what is the problem that we're trying to solve? Now, there's a bunch of different ways that we could do that. But for us, when we look at Baltimore, this is the problem that, well, again, I'll speak for myself. When I look at Baltimore and I see here, this shows you the distribution of poor residents in Baltimore who are Black and who are white. And you see this really high concentration of African Americans in the lowest opportunity neighborhoods. I think, if you're on this call, you have a sense of what created that. You have a sense of what that does. That's a problem that personally, I think we want to solve, and housing mobility programs are a tool we have to actually address that. So that's wonderful news. We have a tool to address that. Now the question is, how do we measure success? So the way that we're going to measure success is we're going to look at the difference in neighborhoods between poor white residents of a metro and poor Black residents of a metro. So these two lines are showing cumulative distribution functions. Essentially the data that I just showed you. In solid, that's Black in the data, dashed is white in the data. And so the area between these two lines in some sense is giving you a measure of how unequal the neighborhoods are of Black and white poor residents in a metro. So we're going to define this measure, call it racial equality. And racial equality is going to be 100 when this area shrinks down to 0, when they're on top of each other, meaning that Black and white poor residents live in very similar neighborhoods. And racial equality is going to be 0 as that area grows and is as large as possible in this figure, saying that Black and white residents live in as unequal of neighborhoods as possible. So now we're going to run this housing mobility program that I told you about earlier. We're going to do it in Baltimore. And now, again, here we have these CDFs that tell you what kind of neighborhoods people live in. So what we want is to move the CDF, especially the African-American one, to the right. That's moving people to higher quality neighborhoods. And what you see is you run this housing mobility program that I described, and it happens. The African-American population in Baltimore shifts over, and it's starting to look more equal. It's moving toward the distribution for poor whites in Baltimore. Now that was Baltimore. So this figure is what I'm going to use now. I don't know how much time I have if anyone wants to give me a time check, but so this figure is going to show you all the 54 largest metros in the United States. So these are metros with at least 1 million in population. So on the x-axis on the bottom here, that's what we see in the data today. That's racial equality, current level. Now, everything above that 45-degree line means that we're getting improvement. So on the y-axis there on the left, that's racial equality after we've run this housing mobility program. So in blue there, that shows you Baltimore. So Baltimore is under 40% in terms of racial equality in the data right now. You run this program, it's above 50. To me, I look at this figure, and first of all, you'll see that there are a bunch all the way at 100. That's great news. And you just see that this is a tool to improve racial equality. So that makes me happy. That's a really good thing in my opinion. And I think everyone, paying attention already knows this. We can look at different places. So here's Baltimore, Cleveland, we are right next to you. Very similar in a lot of ways. Let's see, another couple places with prominent programs. So Chicago is here, Dallas here, DC, Seattle's way up here, and Charlotte's over here. So a couple comments about this, and then we'll move into tweaks to this to see what matters most. But the first, I just want to hit head on this issue about canceling the suburbs. So when we run a program like this, where there's a maximum of 30 families per tract, I can tell you that in Baltimore, with that kind of a housing mobility program, that means that about a little bit under 4% of Black residents, sorry for the typo, of poor Black residents are going to be moving. Now, in the top third of tracts, there's almost a million original residents. There will be about 11,000 movers. So this means we're going to have about 1.2% of the original population moving in with a mobility program of this size. So, another thing that, I'm not going to talk about too much, but I think, politically, I think is really worth mentioning is the fact that this is a program with 30 as a max. I think housing mobility programs are something politically that are just begging for a kind of incremental implementation. Let's run a program with 10 families. If you're in it, obviously we don't need to do this in Baltimore or in some of these other sites, but you know, if you're in a place where people are hesitant, run a small one. It's moving things in the right direction and let it grow over time. I think that's an advantage of housing mobility programs that really needs to be exploited. But the point is, even with this like kind of fully, you know, fully formed or fully operational housing mobility program, again, Cleveland, you look at one where we're considering this like kind of a fully implemented, this is about the size of the housing mobility program that BRHP runs. In Cleveland, this is going to be 3% of poor Black residents. You know, in terms of the top third of tracts, they're accepting just a little bit over 1% of the original population. You know, if that's canceling the suburbs, then, you know, the delicate little flower is the suburbs. Okay, so one thing we can do is we can change the target measure. So we can say, first question is, you know, well, how much does it matter? We showed you those maps, we showed you the statistical analysis. What if we looked and we made the opportunity map in terms of the top third of the metro's tracks, in terms of poverty or quality or the COI or the opportunity atlas? What happens? So we can look at these CDFs. This is, so say that you're someone, you know, we have some people from the BRHP board or former board members. Imagine you guys are, you know, all trying to figure out what's the measure we should use. And you're one of those people that's really invested in poverty. You think poverty really matters. And you're really worried that there's someone else that's really invested in, I don't know, COI. So what this figure tells you is that when you run the program, so, you know, these different symbols here show you that this is what happens to poverty, the CDF, the distribution of poverty, when you design the program around these other measures of neighborhood opportunity. You know, it doesn't really matter. If you care about poverty, you run the H to the housing mobility program designed around any of these measures, things are going to work out the way you want. Say that you're one of those people that really is sure that neighborhood quality captures all the neighborhood effects. That's the measure that really matters. Again, you see that it doesn't really matter what measure of neighborhood opportunity you design the program around, you're going to get very similar results. Same thing if you really care about childhood opportunity index. There's a little bit more differences in terms of the opportunity atlas, still relatively small. Yeah. And so this figure now is going to show you this vertical line here, highlighted in blue is Baltimore. So this figure now, these vertical lines are going to show you essentially how much racial equality are you going to improve, is it going to increase if you care about quality and you're able to design a housing mobility program around quality rather than poverty. So there's a couple where it might move more than say 10, but in general, it doesn't seem to really matter much. Now, the trade-off between quality and COI is even smaller. Those are probably the most closely related measures. And quality, instead of the opportunity atlas, you know, there's those two tracks, and there's two metros in the very top where it seems to matter a bit, but otherwise, you know, really muted effects. Now, another thing we can do is we can say, okay, well, maybe this isn't the target population that's going to be in the housing mobility program. Maybe instead, we're just going to look and focus on low-income people in a metro. That's all we're going to do. If we do that, what you see is just this massive, massive decline. So in the top here, I'm saying that instead of targeting Black poor residents in the lowest quality tracts, now we're only going to be targeting poor residents. And the blue lines are to indicate these are metros where you have about a third of the metros poor, at least, are Black. That's going to be interesting in some of the later simulations to be able to disentangle that. But what you see here is that almost all of these, in almost every metro, you know, in terms of racial equality, the success is falling back down to where things were before you even ran the program. So, you know, if you care about racial equality, if that's your objective, then in this case, if you're just targeting poor residents, you kind of might as well not run the program. That's what this is telling you. Of course, other problems could be solved and other issues are addressed by running those programs. So I don't want to totally, you know, dismiss them. But I do want to make the point that, you know, from this perspective, there's just a massive decline in success. On the other hand, what if we just include another tweak to the target population? We say, well, we are going to focus on low-income residents, but those in the lowest opportunity tracts. Now we see that where before we have this huge, massive decline, you get a lot of that improvement back, especially in the metros where, you know, you have a large share of African Americans in the poor population in those metros. Now we might also think about target destination. There's a lot of, I think, kind of, issues politically in terms of how do you actually organize a housing mobility program. So we might think about both participants and eligible tracts only being located in a metro central county. If we do that, again, we're going to see relatively large declines in terms of the success in generating racial equality. So again, the length of those vertical lines is going to tell you how much you're losing by only focusing on the central county in a metro rather than having a regional partnership that can extend towards the whole metro. One thing that's interesting here, though, is that if you look at metros that are where the share of the share of poor who are African American is relatively high, those don't fall as far as it seems like as the other metros fall. Okay, and then the last thing we're going to do here to think about these factors is we're going to think about housing supply. And now we're going to say, well, what if there's no constraint on housing supply? So what if instead of what we've done before, now we say that just 30 families are going to move in. If it's top third, we don't really care what's going on in terms of the units that are there right now. We're just going to move 30 people in, or sorry, 30 families. And now the length of those vertical lines tells you the improvement based over the baseline housing mobility program. And you see these massive improvements. So, this housing supply constraint is very binding. Now, is 7.5% of units the correct assumption? We don't know. But the point is, the results are very sensitive to the housing supply constraint. And that's an important conclusion. So to summarize this, one of the, I went through this relatively quickly, and it's a little bit hard to judge the changes. So one of the things we can do is we can say relative to the original housing mobility program, the baseline, as a percentage of that, let's weight those bars, the length of those bars, by the share of the Black population in all metros to get a sense of the changes, how these changes impact poor Black residents overall. And so what you see on the y-axis here is going to be the relative change in success. On the x-axis are these changes that we look at. So say that we really care about quality and we're thinking about racial equality in terms of neighborhood quality. If we change and we're going to look at poverty, we're going to design a housing mobility program around the Childhood Opportunity Index or the Opportunity Atlas. You're going to have some decline in success, but there's a question about how much of that's going to be statistical noise anyway. I don't put a lot of weight on that. On the other hand, if you design the housing mobility program entirely around just the poor residents of the metro, you're going to see this huge decline in the success in terms of racial equality. If you're focusing just on the poor in the lowest quality tracts, you're going to get a bunch of that back, but not all of it. It still is going to be a very large decline if you can't specifically target African Americans. If you're just looking at the central county in the metro, again, you're going to have a large decline in success overall. And if you can get rid of that housing supply constraint, if you aren't, having to deal with it, you're going to have a lot more success. So, this is a really important issue that's, on scale with, this issue of just focusing on poor residents. So I'll wrap up very quickly then. So, in this paper, we're going to be able to think about the success of housing mobility programs, running the simulations, able to tweak specific design choices to get a sense of, when we think about success in terms of this original goal of racial equality, there's other goals that we might want to address, but we're thinking about this as a goal of housing mobility programs. What happens? How important are these various issues? So, the choice of neighborhood opportunity index, we don't think that's a super important choice. The choice between county versus regional scope, that seems to be, much more so an important issue. This issue about housing supply and access seems extremely important. And thinking about eligibility criteria, if not race-based, at least being race-conscious, seems to us also to be extremely important. So, in our baseline, where we're actually able to target African Americans, poor African Americans in the lowest opportunity neighborhoods, we know that's going to have big effects on racial equality. It's going to improve things. If we just focus on poor residents in a metro, a lot of good things might happen, but we're not going to improve racial equality. And if we're able to focus, just on poor residents in the lowest opportunity neighborhoods, it's going to be better than just focusing on just on the poor in a metro, but it's not going to get us all the way back to the original kind of baseline goal. So those are our results. Thanks everyone